This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Newseum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
We're joined now by Dr. John Yoo, who served as a Justice Department attorney under the Bush administration. Where were you on 9/11 when things started to happen, and what did you think? You, like most people involved in national security, probably were not completely surprised, but take us back to what happened to you that day.
I was sitting at my desk at the Justice Department. I was told that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I went to see the television and saw the live feed of the second plane hitting the World Trade Center. And as you may remember, at that point, the whole city evacuated, at least most of the city. But I stayed behind because I was one of those people who did specialize in national security and had to start working immediately on the legal aspects of the response to 9/11. And I remember the first thing that came into my mind. I mean, I was surprised and maybe shocked, but it wasn't outside the realm of possibility that this would happen. But the first thing that came to mind is that this is war. You know, this is not some kind of random crime by a lone crazy person like the Oklahoma City bombing, but the timing and the sophistication and really the selection of the targets all had the fingerprints of Al-Qaeda on them. And I was someone who right away thought, the law enforcement paradigm that we've been using, both political parties, many administrations had applied to terrorism, didn't work anymore because it had failed to stop these terrible attacks.
Right. Yeah, I think many smart people in national security, the second plane hit the towers. They said this has got to be Al-Qaeda. They're the ones that would have the planning, the organization, the capabilities to pull something like this out that was so sophisticated. But when you said you had to start working on the legal aspects of this, what does that mean?
Right away, questions started to arise about how we could respond. For example, one of the most difficult immediate questions, and one that we still grapple with today and we're going to be grappling with for the future, is can we fight a war against a group, not a state? All of our wars generally in the past, and most wars by the time of 2001, were between the United States and other countries. And here you could see we're fighting a group of people who weren't all of one nationality. They didn't have a territory. They didn't have a population. They hid themselves, camouflaged themselves, and they violated all the rules of war. The most important rule of warfare from the Greek period on was that you don't attack civilians. You don't target civilians. And on 9/11, the thing that was put spectacularly on display is that we were going to fight an enemy that only wanted to attack civilians. In fact, they would flee from any pure displays of American military power. And so we saw that they would not follow any of the rules that we were used to.
Including a very fundamental rule is that they didn't care about living, or they would rather die than live, which people in the military would tell you is tremendously difficult to fight against. What do you do when you're facing an enemy really doesn't care whether or not he dies? As a matter of fact, would in many cases prefer to die. It's very difficult to fight against. It's
a great point, because a lot of the rules of war that the Western countries have developed over thousands of years are all built in the idea of reciprocity. We're going to act a certain way so that you act a certain way, and therefore we can confine and limit the horrors of war and try to protect civilians as much as possible. If you're fighting an enemy that won't obey any rules and doesn't care about the future, you can't create incentives to get them to act in a civilized manner. They couldn't succeed unless they were willing to violate the rules of war. The 9/11 text, disguising yourself as civilian, hijacking civilian airliners and plunging them, at least in New York City, into civilian targets, violates every basic rule of warfare that we've had in Western civilization for thousands of years. So that's one of the very first things, is how do we respond to a group like that? And then what kind of force can we use, and how can we use it? What if we have to enter the territory of other countries? All those questions came up. Do we need a declaration of war? All those questions came up. So I don't think I went home until 4 a.m. that night. And here's just another memory. I just remember driving across the 14th Street Bridge, which is, for those who don't know Washington's geography well, crosses right near the Pentagon. And I saw something I thought I'd never see in my lifetime, which was the Pentagon lit up on fire at night. You could see for miles around the Pentagon, even though it's the dark of night, because the place was on fire. I thought I'd never see that in my lifetime.
Right. I went home at about maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. The next morning, to go home and shower and change my clothes, and I drove back into town across the Key Bridge, and there were tanks on the bridge. And I literally stopped my car and thought to myself, there's something I never thought I would see in my lifetime, tanks on the Key Bridge.
Or combat air patrols flying over the Capitol round the clock.
Okay, so how hard was it? This sounds like a silly question, but it's not. How hard was it you're dealing with truly the first major battle, if you will, of 21st century unconventional warfighting? How hard was it to haul somewhat antiquated rules and regulations when it comes to warfare to apply them to those situations?
It's a great question because unlike a lot of things in law, you couldn't pull a book off the bookshelf and look it up.
Well, law is so much, I'm sorry to interrupt, but law is so much about precedent, right?
Yes.
And here you were almost disadvantaged if you used precedent.
That's exactly right. In the law, we'd like to have frameworks. Law works best when we've thought about things in advance and worked it all out.
And examples of how this happened before.
Exactly.
Right.
And then we try and we can apply to new facts. But basically, the rules of car accidents have been set for a long time, and so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But here we had something that was outside the experience of the United States. We'd never really had to face something like this. And we couldn't pull a book off the shelf and say, oh, here's how we do it. So that's one thing. But the other thing that made it even more pressing and difficult was we were under the pressure of an ongoing hot war where we were having trouble finding the enemy. We really didn't know that much about them, knew very little about them, and we all expected another attack, and we knew that they had this history of attacking the same targets repeatedly. And so we had to come up with these new rules, adapt the ideas of warfare to this new kind of enemy, but in the middle of a war, not before the war or after the war.
Right, not looking back, not looking ahead. And how you classified them. I remember at the time wishing we really had more time to think about and to discuss, and then my job, communicate to the American people and others what we were trying to do, because again, the vocabulary got so challenging. These terrorists were they don't work for or serve for a country. They're not in a uniform. They're certainly shouldn't have the Geneva Conventions apply to them. But why wouldn't you call them pirates? Or how do you technically classify somebody as a terrorist versus something else?
Well, Torie, first, let me compliment you on the job you all did, because I thought actually the communication strategy was extremely effective in really describing to the American people what we were doing and why. And I've always been struck at the high levels of public support there were for all of these decisions. You think about these new military commissions that were set up, designating them as enemy combatants. I think despite all the arguments that we have in the media or the universities, I think the American people, for the most part, are very reasonable, and they understood what we were doing, and they got it. And I think there's a lot more flash and light that goes on in the newspapers than when it comes down to people, American people at the dinner table talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a very good point. I do think the American people in general said, okay, well, we may not know all the right words, we get it. These guys are different than the guys we saw in our World War II movie.
But as you said, we had to go back and look at things that had happened in American history long ago, like Indian tribes, for example. We looked at what they did with Indian tribes. Pirates, as you said, we looked at very few experiences we've had pirates. We looked at what other countries have done, because Israel and Great Britain and France, there have been other Western countries that have faced similar problems, and we looked at how they did it. And I think what we tried to do is, we had to come up with a new category, but actually it was a category that had existed a long time ago, and then we had to update it for today's purposes. So, for example, the Geneva Convention issue was such an important fundamental issue in the beginning, but I think was quite straightforward when you thought about it, because the Geneva Convention every American knows about, because we see it in the movies and TV shows, and the United States is one of the great promoters of the Geneva Conventions when we fight other countries. But these were people we were fighting who didn't fight on behalf of any country. They never signed the Geneva Conventions, and they would never give the rights of the Geneva Conventions to anyone else. They don't take prisoners. They just, there were the incidents, you know them as well, in the invasion of Afghanistan, where we saw them executing American soldiers that they captured. Right. So I think that, when you explain it that way, I think the American people got it, and it was legally sound that we would be humane and treat prisoners but we're not going to pretend that they are honorable soldiers who are fighting on behalf of other countries, which is what the Geneva Conventions are
Right.
about.
Now, I distinctly remember being in a meeting with Secretary Rumsfeld in the fall of '01, not long after 9/11, and among the many things he put on the table in front of the senior staff at the time, was, okay, unconventional warfighting, very unconventional times. Ought we not be developing a new policy for detainees or these people that we take? I don't know that we even called them detainees at that particular meeting. He says, shouldn't we be developing the new detainee policies that are appropriate for this time and what we're going through? And it was tough slogging, to say the least. Looking back and with the perspective we have, what should we have been doing sooner? How could we have better developed and or communicated what we were trying to do with detainees at the time?
I think I look back and we could make things better, but when you look back at the pressure of time and the resources available, I can't find fault with what we did at Guantanamo Bay. Mm-hmm. Take, for example, just setting up the Guantanamo Bay camp. There was no pre-existing place, and so Guantanamo Bay already had the facility there, but it was there because of the Haitian refugee problem, years before. But you can't fault the Defense Department. I can't, or the military, for not having an instantly built prison camp in preparation for this, because no one had anticipated that this would ever happen. So, I think the folks down there, what they did is they did the best they did with the resources they had, and then over time the camp was upgraded to the point where I think now Guantanamo Bay is a much better prison facility than most federal prisons and state prisons in the United States.
Oh, I think with even back then when it first started, I remember we took Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, on a trip down there, and she had headed up the Bureau of Prisons or something like that in California, so she had some familiarity. And she came away from that trip saying, this is better than most of the prisons in California. And
that's
I think,
true.
Nobody in his right mind wants to run a prison. But again, given the unusual circumstances, you look back and go, okay, it was the best answer at the time. And I think the validation of that is, despite how much the current administration clearly would have loved to have shut down Gitmo, it took them about a week in office to realize, you know what, we need to have that, and we can't get rid of it anytime soon. So I think it's validation that in the toughest of circumstances, it probably was the right approach.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the current administration, I have a lot of disagreements with their policies in a lot of different areas, but I think one thing is after a while they realize that reality constrains the kinds of choices you have. I mean, for all the things they said during the campaigns and in their first month or so in office, I do give them credit for eventually becoming a lot more mature about these issues, and there's been a lot more continuity. They didn't want it. I think the top political leadership of the Obama administration didn't want that continuity to occur. But once they came into the office, they had to. And so, I've actually very much reminded, this goes to my work on presidential history, but very much reminded actually of the transition from Truman to Eisenhower. I always like saying Obama is not the new Kennedy, he's the new Eisenhower, which drives Democrats crazy.
Probably drives a few Eisenhower fans crazy, too.
Crazy too. But, Eisenhower campaigned on overturning all of Truman's strategies on the Cold War, and he came into office and he looked around. He's a sensible guy, and basically there was a lot of continuity, and there was a lot of continuity between all the administrations of the Cold War.
Yeah, you and I have mutual friends, and with good reason. They love to grumble and say, "Oh my gosh, Barack Obama and this administration are doing almost exactly everything the Bush administration did in terms of the key national security issues and activities, everything they campaigned against, and it's just not fair." And I said, what would you rather have?
Yes, that's a good point.
It's much better that they're continuing pretty sound policies.
Yeah, okay. I think it's incumbent on us just to point out that that's what they're doing, though, that they are pulling away from their campaign policy, so that in the next election, you can't demagogue it the way they did the last time.
Well, I don't think you'll ever stop people in campaigns from demagoguing. You just can't. Every once in a while I get a little petty and resentful, and I say, I wish they would just acknowledge it once in a while, but I'd rather they continue the policies and not acknowledge it than be nicer to us and do something differently. So talk about how the legal system has changed.
I think the interesting thing that we've had happen is that you have had a lot of acceptance in the legal system. Despite all the criticisms of the Bush administration that occurred in the 2008 campaign, the legal system has, for the most part, kept what the Bush administration put into place in the months after 9/11 intact. The only real setback, I think, in the counterterrorism programs has been the Supreme Court wants to have some kind of last say on the fate of detainees, although they're not willing to say what it's going to be. They wanted the big fight in the courts was just about whether the Supreme Court would have some right to review whether the government was going to be able to keep people at Guantanamo Bay or not. But since then, the courts have not ordered the release of a single person from Guantanamo Bay. But you look at all the other things that have been going on, there were core parts of the framework we came up with in the days after 9/11, the intelligence collection, the drone strikes, detainment, enhanced interrogation, military courts. None of those have actually been reversed by the legal system, by the court system. So I think one thing you were talking earlier about validation, I think one thing that is good about this is I was very conscious at the time, and I'm sure you were, I'm sure Secretary Rumsfeld was, that we not overreact to 9/11, that we've tried to be restrained and moderate, that we didn't want to commit the excesses that had occurred in World War II, World War I, or the Civil War. And I think we did that, and one reason I think you can see validation is that, as you say, the Obama administration, which is elected by a very different base than elected the Bush administration, kept most of those policies in place, whether by wish or by pressure of circumstances. The legal system hasn't rejected much of the basic framework we've had in place for now 10 years.
Which is great tribute to you and your colleagues. I mean, it proves that the hard work that you put into it provided incredibly sound foundation that has been able to adapt and evolve a little bit as the years have gone on, but an incredibly solid foundation that's carried us through pretty well all these years.
Yeah, I like to think that the Bush administration, a lot of things it did, it put into place good DNA.
Great point.
The future evolution of how we deal with counterterrorism. And the basic point that I think the legal system did accept and the Supreme Court did accept is the one that we thought about, all of us in the government, the first hour after the 9/11 taxes, that this is not a criminal justice problem, that this is not going to be handled by the FBI alone and the court system alone, but that the rules of war are what's going to govern, and the military are going to be, and the CIA are going to be the primary people, not the police and the FBI. That's, I think, what causes a lot of the sort of unsettling debates we have, because I think a lot of Americans just at the time of 9/11 weren't familiar with the way war is fought and the way there's a different set of rules in warfare than there are for just catching your garden variety drug dealer or mafia don. And now I think the legal system accepted that was the framework that's going to be used. And so I think we did do a good job in the beginning, making sure that the course was the right one for the country.
Early on, exactly when that debate was starting, I encouraged Secretary Rumsfeld to spend some time at the podium one day reminding people or helping people think that rules of war are different than what goes on with the car thief in Chicago. And I gave my, cliche thing. I said, sir, too many people in this country know what they know about the law from watching many episodes of Law and Order.
I use that exact example too.
Okay, well, it's a great example, although Secretary Rumsfeld, whose mind was an amazing thing, and was not, to put it nicely, this is not a man who followed popular culture a lot. So he goes out there to the podium, from which he usually did a spectacular job, and he kind of gets into this little tutorial about separating the two, and he says, it's because people spend too much time watching L.A. Law.
Well, I'm
blank
stares.
I
thought he was going to say Dragnet.
No, L.A. Law. So we finished the briefing. He goes out and he goes, how was that? And I said, well, it was great, although that show's not been on for 20 years, I think. Okay, very specific question. I've been dying to ask a smart person like you about this. So during the 2008 campaign, McCain and Obama, candidates McCain and Obama, were addressing hypotheticals, which they never should have done. But the hypothetical was, well, what if we know there's some really bad guys or terrorists or somebody's done something awful to us in another country, say across the border in Pakistan? What would you do? And Barack Obama, I'm paraphrasing, basically said we'd go after him, with or without Pakistan's approval. And a lot of people, especially a lot of conservatives, and John McCain in particular, went nuts on this and said, you can't do that. That shows you how naive you are. It shows you how immature you are. You cannot do that. Pakistan is an ally. You can't go into their country and do those sorts of things without their permission. So, A, what did you think about that? And B, were you surprised, or as a legal expert, what did you think about how they went in and got Osama bin Laden?
Well, first I thought that at the time that what Senator Obama said was perfectly right as a policy and a legal matter. I think that and this goes to your second question, if someone from another country is attacking us and killing our civilians and soldiers and presents a future threat to the United States, and that country doesn't do anything to stop them, then the United States has a right of self-defense. We have the right to try to put an end to the threat ourselves. There's delicate issues about Pakistan and their sovereignty. They're this strange country which is half the time an ally of ours and half in the anti-terrorism fight, but half the time they can't even control their own territory, and they're a safe haven for our worst enemies. And the Pakistanis realize that, which is why they silently allow us to conduct the drone strikes. But I think President Obama is quite right on that. I think sometimes Senator McCain, in the campaign, sometimes I found some of his national security positions to be the product sometimes more of sort of an immediate emotional response than careful thought, because he should have agreed with Senator Obama at the time, and he did. I think in the end, when the administration did carry out this strike on Abbottabad and killed bin Laden, I think Senator McCain was supportive. Legally, I think it was perfect. I had some policy disputes with the attack, only in that I wish that the White House had ordered that bin Laden be captured rather than killed because of the great amount of intelligence we would have gotten from him.
Right.
And I think when you look at the details of the operation, they could have captured him. I have the greatest faith in our SEAL teams. I've had some SEALs, former SEALs, as students in law school, and I have every confidence if the president says capture bin Laden rather than kill him, they could have done that too and would have done it.
Right. This isn't quite inside baseball. It's inside baseball on another level. But when that happened, I said, I wish if they were going to kill him, I wish they had at least waited a week before they let everybody know. Because think about the intelligence that they could have gathered in that intervening week when those other al-Qaeda leadership with whom he was communicating in a bizarre fashion, but he was communicating, didn't know where he was. The turbulence that could have created in the community.
I agree with you. I think if you talk to intelligence professionals, they would agree with you too that you don't actually reveal to the other side your successes. You use silently to roll up the organization, which is, if you remember, that's what we did in the Bush administration when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's captured or Abu Zubayr. The public announcement doesn't come right away so that our guys have a chance to take advantage of the victory and use it to go elsewhere. And so I do think that the desire to sort of publicly beat the chest that we finally killed bin Laden did cost us. I do wish we had waited a little time, and I actually wish we had captured him like we have the other al-Qaeda, high-ranking al-Qaeda leaders.
How would the legal system have handled him?
Well, I think this is part of why the White House ordered him killed, is that they didn't like to deal with the messy issues about detention and questioning that the Bush administration had worked through. And so you'll notice actually that one criticism I have had of the Obama administration is that they have generally tried not to capture anybody. So there really hasn't been a single high-level al-Qaeda leader captured in the last 2 years.
Right.
Because it is easier from a legal perspective to just shoot them and kill them, but on the other hand, we're losing lots of intelligence. If you talk to people who are in the CIA, they say, the interrogations of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the planner of the 9/11 attacks, or his 2 lieutenants who we also captured, that's actually how we got almost all of our intelligence on al-Qaeda in the first years of the war.
Right. Okay, let me shift to your book, which I have not had a chance to read. I cannot wait to read. But it's called Confronting Terror, and it's a collection of essays, if you will, by different people and it's obviously timed to the 10th anniversary of 9/11, which is a great time to do this. Tell us about it, who you included in it, what you learned from it as you were putting it together.
Yes, thanks. It's being put out by Encounter Press. It should be available, and it's a book that brought together 20-some people on both sides of the debate and asked them not just to write about the history of 9/11, but to really use as an opportunity to think about what we should be doing in the future, much like the conversation we've been having now. And so we've got people ranging from Ted Olson, who was the Solicitor General at the time, whose wife died in the attacks, to Attorney General John Ashcroft and Michael Mukasey, also Attorney General. On the other side, we have people like the former head of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson. We have famous libertarians like Richard Epstein, and even Republican members of Congress like Bob Barr, who've become very critical of the war on terror. We have some essays by judges who have decided cases rising from 9/11, like Larry Silberman or Ray Randolph. So we've got this big collection, and scholars and historians who are happy always to write whenever anyone asks them. So we have this big volume of people. Some of the things are very interesting things. I think one thing I think is that there's still a lot of dispute in our society, and it still really goes down, putting aside the partisan issues, still does come back to the question of whether we really think the law enforcement or the military war paradigm should apply to 9/11. Even 10 years later, I think that issue still divides the country and still divides people who think about terrorism. That's striking to me, because I think the majority treats it as war, and I think the courts have too. But I think there's still a large number of people in the country who think that this should become a criminal justice problem. The second thing I think is, as we've been talking about, people acknowledge there's been a lot of continuity. And you see Bush administration alumni giving President Obama all due credit for that. And the civil libertarians that we find are just as unhappy, if not maybe more unhappy, with Obama than they were with Bush. And so you see a lot of that recognition in the essays, that there's been some changes. Bush probably would have done some things differently than Obama, but Obama didn't come in and put into effect the revolution that he was promising during the campaign.
Right. How have you changed the most over these 10 years? It seems like a day to me. It seems, I cannot believe 10 years has gone by, but how have you changed, do you think?
Yeah, it's true. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but when you think about all the things that happened, it's been an unbelievable 10 years. I've probably got a little more gray hair than I had back then. We all do. But I think I see the other sides of things better than I did back then, because I think back then we didn't have time to look at every angle of these problems. Now that we're all out of office, I think we have more time to reflect on what we did and to see different angles and see other perspectives, or at least have more time to do it. The other thing is I definitely have a much more of appreciation for the people who have to carry out these decisions and make them. So I think a lot of us, when we're not in the government, we're in the media, the academy, or just at home, we have the luxury of time and resources to pick over decisions, because when you are in the government, you have very little time and imperfect information and limited resources to make a decision. But historians could spend years, what we call in law, relitigating the issue.
Right.
So now I have a lot more sympathy for the people who actually have to make these sort of almost split-second decisions. Decisions we were making back in the days after 9/11 would normally take the government years to make.
Right. Yeah, I always say it's so easy to run the government from the confines of a lovely studio in downtown Washington, D.C. Every decision is perfect, carefully thought out. Hey, a quick and stupid question for you. Maybe it's not so stupid. Why has it taken so long to try the 9/11 conspirators?
Well, I think part of this is the Obama administration's fault, because, as you know, they have jumped back and forth on it. Part of it, I think, was due to the courts, because they wanted to have some kind of review over the 9/11 defendants. We haven't really had most of the, we've had some of them since around 2003 and 2004, but immediately lawyers brought lawsuits all the way to the Supreme Court to stop any kind of trial. And so those cases don't get decided until 2007, some until 2008. So the courts had basically put a block in front. And then when the Obama administration came in, Attorney General Holder tried to transfer them to downtown New York City for trial, which I thought was crazy, but put another 2-year delay into the process. So, and you can tell this is an area where I think there is continuity, but the Obama administration doesn't have their heart in it. I don't think they really want to try them at all. And so I'd be very surprised if the military commission gets going very far in Guantanamo Bay to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his co-conspirators. My own personal perspective is that I don't think we should try them until they have no more intelligence value, because when you try people like this, we will have to reveal a good number of our national security secrets into open court, and that's not going to be worth it until later in the war. So in a way, it might have been good that it's taken this long.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Okay, last question. I promise, last question. So it's 10 years later. There are a lot of people who will be listening to this, and you know what real people are like. They've got jobs, they've got families. They're so busy, they're so overwhelmed with just things they have to do to get through with their lives, and they don't sit and think about these issues the way you and I do. But if you could ask them just for a few minutes to think about one thing in terms of our country, the war on terror, looking ahead, what would you want them thinking about?
Well, I would want them to think about, was it worth it? What we gained was security. So we did succeed in preventing quite a bit of attacks on the United States.
Right.
There's not been another 9/11 attack in 10 years, which if you'd asked any expert back in the months or even years after 9/11, they would never have thought this would happen.
Right. Non-experts like yours truly, absolutely. People did ask those questions, and we said no. You know, they took from 93 to 2001 to get that done. They'll take some time, but we were pretty sure another one would happen.
Unfortunately, it's too easy. I mean, we live in an open society, which is a great thing and makes our country strong, but because of that, it's extremely easy to get people into the country to blow things up, as we saw on 9/11. So the question that people should think about is, that was the benefit we gained. Has there really been the kind of cost to our society that you see people complaining about in the media or on the left or in the academy? I actually think that civil liberties have not taken a big hit. If you look at where we were 10 years ago, I think we had an enormous flourishing of civil liberties in this country, not because the government promotes it, but just because the government's been out of the way. I mean, all the huge burst in the internet, radio talk shows, cable news. I think there's way more civil liberties and freedom now than there were 10 years ago, and I don't think there's been this huge suppression of our rights and liberties because of national security. What worries me are things like the debt and spending and Obamacare, things that we're doing to ourselves for domestic purposes. But in thinking about the war on terrorism, that's why because I think it is all a trade-off. Everything in the security world is a trade-off. Everything in life is a trade-off. You're willing to sacrifice some things to have a better world and other things. And I think with the war on terrorism, that's what I think Americans should ask themselves is, have we gained this security that no one ever thought we could achieve 10 years ago at a reasonable cost? And I find it hard to believe that people would say it came at too expensive a price.
Great last words. John Yoo, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for all your service. Thanks for all you do. And we will talk to you soon.
Torie, thanks a lot for having me on, and it was great to catch up.
All right, you too. Take care.
This is 9/11, 10 years after.